All right, welcome back to Lessons from the Prophet Jonah. We had some technological difficulties last time and we're not able to record the session, so I'm going to do a little makeup video for those interested in keeping up with the series. In Lesson 3, we're finally going to begin to exegete the text of the book of Jonah. And in so doing, we're going to start to notice some of the literary devices that our author uses in his story. We're going to look at some irony in the way the prophet responds. And we're also going to take into consideration some important geography for the story. So let me get my Bible opened up to Jonah. So we see Jonah's commissioning and flight in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, where we read, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord." Now we notice here in the beginning of the story something very odd. At face value, when you begin to read it, it seems like a normal prophetic book. Okay, it begins the same way as any other prophetic book would. The word of the Lord came to so-and-so responds by obeying the Lord. But we're caught off guard by Jonah's decision. Jonah does not respond with obedience like every other prophet does. So to the original reader, if you read the beginning of this book, you're going to be thinking, okay, this is a regular prophet. But then you're going to be caught off guard by this decision of Jonah's. You're going to think, whoa, something strange is going on here. He's not doing what all the other prophets do. So just to give us some context, here is a map of the Assyrian Empire. We can see the Mediterranean Sea off to the left. And there in the red circle we have Jerusalem and Samaria. This is Israel. This is the land of Israel. Samaria there represents the northern kingdom of Israel, which Jonah was from, and Jerusalem there would represent the southern kingdom of Judah. And this map is taken 100 to 150 years before the events of the book of Jonah. We see up at the top there is the city Nineveh. We see it there with some surrounding cities. It's just north of the Tigris River. We see if Jonah would have wanted to get to Nineveh, if he would have obeyed the Lord, well, when the word of the Lord came to him, and Jonah's thinking about this mission of going to Nineveh, this is the sort of map he's going to have in mind of the journey that it's going to take him. He would have to travel many, many miles and cross two enormous rivers in order to get to Nineveh. Here's another map of the Assyrian Empire. This one is slightly more relevant as far as our Jonah time period, but it's a little bit more difficult to read, so that's why I like the other map. But you can see Israel there on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, with Jerusalem and Damascus, and then right there in the middle with the red star is Nineveh. So we see that God calls Jonah. We've talked about how this begins like a normal prophetic book. We also have some wordplay going on, some puns, if you will. These are literary devices that our writer is using to create a story that's enjoyable to read. You see, in verse 2, God says to Jonah, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." Now, that's the ESV rendering. In the Hebrew, this could literally be rendered, "Their evil has come up before my face," before God's face. Okay? Now, if you look down the end of verse 3, Jonah paid the fare, went down into the ship to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. Well, guess what? That language there in the Hebrew, it could also literally be translated from the face of the Lord. He went away from the face of the Lord. So you have this sort of wordplay going on, the evil of Nineveh coming up before God's face, and Jonah fleeing from before God's face, to sort of tie this introductory statement together. We also see in verse 2 that God's command to Jonah is to arise. But then in verse 3, we read that Jonah rose to flee. This is the same Hebrew word used in verse 2 for arise. Jonah rose. So in essence, Jonah began to do what God told him to do. He began to arise. The only contrast is he went the wrong way. And that language is used there, the language contrasting between what God commanded Jonah to do and what Jonah actually did. Similar language is used there to really highlight this disobedience of Jonah, to highlight that, hey, he's not doing what's expected of him. Okay? And this is jarring. Your original reader is going to look at this and say, something's not right. And this begins our theme of suspense. We looked at last week how the book of Jonah is full of suspense. And right away, the reader is confronted with an action of Jonah that seems inexplicable. And yet we're not told what's going on. Not till the very end of the book do we get some explanation for Jonah's actions. We see that Jonah runs, and we've looked at how this is jarring. Okay, your original reader would have been very concerned, because God's prophets never run from him. And this is also spontaneous in the fact that the action, the series of verbs listed in verse 3, it moves very, very rapidly. You know, the city of Joppa, where Jonah left for the ship, was probably a 2-day journey from Jonah's hometown. So assuming Jonah got his call from his hometown, you know, it would have taken him a decent period of time to enact his decision. And yet we are given these verbs in a rapid-fire series of events, really emphasizing how Jonah wants to get away. He wants to quickly get away from what God wants him to do. And this can sometimes be paralleled in our own lives. And this is one thing I want us to take away from the book of Jonah, that our drawing near to God is generally done at a snail's pace, but our departure from God is frequently done by leaps and bounds. And that is a quote from John Butler in his commentary, Jonah the Parochial Prophet. He says the reason for this is that we are conditioning ourselves spiritually to react disobediently more than we are conditioning ourselves to obey. We feed the flesh and make it healthy and vigorous, but we starve the spirit so it is nearly lifeless. The rapidity with which we hit the road to Joppa may shock others and even ourselves. But if the inward spiritual life has been corroding, then we will sooner or later manifest spontaneity in pronounced disobedience. So you could use the analogy of a bodybuilder or anyone who works out. They condition their muscles so that they can be strong. And if they neglect their muscles, if they don't feed them the proper nutrition and don't work them out regularly, they're not going to be strong like they want. And if we want to be strong spiritually, we have to make sure we're conditioning our spiritual life. We have to make sure we're working out from a spiritual standpoint. And if we don't do that, we're often going to find ourselves in Jonah's situation, where we are so quick to run away from the will of God. We're so quick to depart ourselves from what God wants us to do, to react disobediently, because that's the way we've been conditioning ourselves. We've been exercising the flesh. We've been indulging our fleshly desires instead of working out spiritually and disciplining ourselves. So this is a good thing to keep in mind. And I asked this question in the lesson: in what ways does it often cost us more to run than it does to obey? It has been noted that if Jonah had not gone to Tarshish, not gone away from what the Lord wanted him to do, he would not have had to spend the presumably great amount of money he did on the ship fare. Indeed, the Hebrew language there indicates that Jonah literally hired the ship. It's kind of the way the Hebrew is parsed there. So it's a good question for us to consider in what ways it often costs us more to run than it does to obey. So now we're going to transition to a topic that I brought up that might seem a little bit irrelevant, but there is actually controversy among scholarship as to the location of this place called Tarshish that Jonah flees to. And we're going to look at this. I brought up on our class on Sunday the question: if somebody approaches you, or if you're talking to somebody about the Bible, and they tell you, well, the Bible's full of errors and full of contradictions, how are you going to respond to that person? Now, if you're a biblicist, if you're a fundamental Christian, you probably believe that the Bible is inerrant. Okay, it doesn't contain errors, it doesn't contain contradictions, and anything that may be thought of as a contradiction has a workable explanation to get around it. And that's true, okay? But the reality is, we live in a world that's hostile to the Bible, to the gospel. We live in a world who would just love to tear apart our faith in the Bible and in God. And if the world can find ways to use the Bible against us, if they can point out errors and contradictions, supposed contradictions, I should say, in the Bible, how are we going to respond to that? And so I think that it is beneficial for us to talk about places where the Bible seems to contradict itself. It's good to talk about those things in the safety of church, okay? In an environment where we all love God's Word and we all believe that contradictions can be reconciled, instead of encountering these contradictions out in the world where you're arguing with somebody antagonistic towards the Bible, and then you're going to find yourself tripping up because you haven't studied these things. And they're going to be able to prove their point. So it's very important for us to just be conscious of this fact that there are things in the Bible which seem to contradict themselves. There are places in the Bible where we find some incongruity. And it's good for us to wrestle with those things before we're confronted with those things. Now, this is a fairly minor contradiction as far as importance. I asked the question, where is Tarshish? Is it in the east or is it in the west? And as we're going to look at in a minute, it really doesn't matter where it is. What matters is the theological messaging behind Jonah's trip to Tarshish. But nevertheless, it's fairly interesting that there are passages in the Bible that seem to indicate that Tarshish is to the east of Israel, to the southeast, I should say, in either the Red Sea or more likely the Indian Ocean. But then there's other passages, such as our passage in Jonah here, which indicate that Tarshish is to the west of Israel in the Mediterranean Sea. And so we're going to wrestle with that briefly here. You can turn, if you want, to the passage in 2 Chronicles 9. Some preliminary thoughts. Tarshish is used occasionally in the Bible to refer to the name of a person. We find this in Genesis 10, verse 4, 1 Chronicles 1:7, 1 Chronicles 7:10, and Esther 1:14. It's also used in the Bible quite frequently to refer to a gemstone, most likely the beryl gemstone. That's B-E-R-Y-L, beryl, which is kind of a yellowish gemstone normally. We see that in Exodus 28, verse 20, where it's used as one of the gemstones on the high priest's breastplate. In Exodus 39:13, we see it in Song of Solomon 5:14. In Ezekiel 1:16, 10:9, 28:13, it's used as a gemstone. And in Daniel 10, verse 6. Now, because it is used as a gemstone, some people have speculated that this place Tarshish is the source of this gemstone. It's a place where this particular gem is mined. And in fact, the name Tarshish could actually be parsed as meaning a place where metals are found or metals are mined. So there's some good logic behind that. Now it's used as a geographical location several times. We see it in the book of 1 Kings, in the book of 2 Chronicles. We see it in the Psalms, used as a place name. Several times in the book of Isaiah, once in Jeremiah, a couple times in the book of Ezekiel, and we see it here in the book of Jonah. And it's interesting because Tarshish is actually the most frequently attested place name in the Bible outside of the realm of Canaan. So it's kind of interesting. It's a fairly frequent place name in the Bible. So I think the traditional view is that Tarshish coincides with Tartessus in Spain, which is obviously in the Mediterranean Sea. Now here's a map that shows Nineveh, Gath-Hepher, which is Jonah's hometown, and there you can kind of see the route Jonah would have taken to get up to Nineveh. You also see Joppa there, the port where Jonah would have left from. And you see the journey to Tarshish from there. Now that's kind of the traditional view of Tarshish. But here is a map of Solomon's empire. And we're going to read 2 Chronicles chapter 9. And we're going to note something very interesting. In 2 Chronicles chapter 9, we read of Solomon. Okay, Solomon is well established in his kingdom, and he starts doing these nautical ventures in association with the king of Tyre. You see Tyre there to the northwest of Israel. If you read in chapter 8, starting in verse 17, then Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and Eloth on the shore of the sea in the land of Edom, and Hiram sent to him by the hand of his servants ships and servants familiar with the sea. And they went to Ophir together with the servants of Solomon, and brought from there 450 talents of gold, and brought it to King Solomon. So here we see Solomon begin this sea venture with King Hiram of Tyre. The Phoenicians, and King Hiram of Tyre was a Phoenician. The Phoenicians were well known for their nautical prowess. Okay, they did all sorts of seafaring ventures. And so they have experience with this. So Solomon gets in cahoots with Hiram. But then we see in chapter 9, verse 21, for the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish used to come, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. So here we have a reference, and many believe this is a reference to the same nautical venture referenced at the end of chapter 8, where they also go to this place called Tarshish. Okay? Now, what's interesting is if you go to chapter 20 of 2 Chronicles, where we're going to find Jehoshaphat, one of the kings of Israel. He knows about the ventures of his great-great-grandfather, Solomon. And he wants to go and fetch gold for himself. So we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, And verse 35, after this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, joined with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who acted wickedly. He joined him in building ships to go to Tarshish, and they built the ships in Ezion-Geber. Then Eleazar, the son of Dodavahu of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, because you have joined with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made. And the ships were wrecked, and were not able to go to Tarshish. And then if you read at the end of the book of 2 Kings, in 1 Kings chapter 22. The end of the book of 1 Kings. Now this is the parallel account to what we just read in Chronicles. Verse 47, there was no king in Edom, a deputy was king. Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold. But they did not go, for the ships were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. So we have this place called Ophir, and Ophir shows up several times in the Bible, and it is demonstrably in the east, probably in India or maybe as far as Indonesia. And we see Solomon sends ships to Ophir from this port, Ezion-Geber, which is right down here to the south of Judah on the Red Sea. And we also see that Tarshish is sort of linked with Ophir and these ventures of Solomon going east. Now, if you were to send ships into the east, you would send them from a port like Ezion-Geber onto the Red Sea. And the Red Sea leads out into the Indian Ocean. But if you're going to send ships west into the Mediterranean Sea, you would leave from a port like Joppa. You would never leave from Ezion-Geber. So this leads some scholars to think that Tarshish is actually to the east. So here are our proofs. We have Solomon. He built a navy at Ezion-Geber to go to Ophir and apparently also to Tarshish. We have Jehoshaphat, who tried to build a navy at Ezion-Geber to go to Ophir and Tarshish. And since the port to go to Tarshish is connected to the Red Sea, Tarshish must be in the Red Sea, or the Indian Ocean. Okay, it must be to the southeast of Israel. And so if Tarshish is in the east, it could be somewhere down there, in the south of the Red Sea. Could be maybe somewhere in India, or perhaps somewhere in Indonesia or the Philippines. Ophir is certainly in one of these places. And it seems that Tarshish and Ophir are equated in these passages. So what's actually going on here? Is that where Tarshish is? Why would Jonah leave from Joppa if Tarshish was in the east? How could this be? And one scholar has suggested that perhaps the Nile Canal, which connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea in Egypt, perhaps the Nile Canal had been constructed at the time of Jonah. And thus he could sail from Joppa and go down through the canal into the Red Sea. But this doesn't seem to be very likely. Historically, it doesn't seem like the canal was built at the time of Jonah. It would have been just after Jonah's time. And secondly, why did Jonah just not go down to Ezion-Geber? Why didn't he just go down directly to the Red Sea instead of sailing from Joppa? So there seems to be a problem here. So others argue that Tarshish is in the west. Okay? And they base this largely off the narrative of Jonah. Jonah leaves for Tarshish from Joppa, which is a Mediterranean port. But there are other proofs. Tarshish is closely tied with Javan, Tubal, and Meshech, which are all sons of Japheth, and with Tyre and Sidon, who are in the Mediterranean. We see that in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 4, now Genesis chapter 10 is the Table of Nations, and in the Table of Nations we find that Japheth had a lot of sons who are associated with people groups that inhabited the northern Mediterranean coast. Okay, so Greece and Italy and even Turkey. The sons of Japheth would have headed up this way. And in Genesis 10 and verse 4, we read, the sons of Japheth, in verse 2, the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, okay, there's our three guys, and Tyrus, okay, there's Tyre, the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these the coastland peoples spread to their lands, each with his own language, by their clans, in their nations. So we read that Tarshish is actually a grandson of Japheth, son of Javan, and Javan is explicitly associated with the Greeks. Now we read in Isaiah 66:19, Ezekiel 27:12-13, and in other passages that Tarshish is again linked with Javan, Tubal, and Meshech. And he's linked with Tyre and Sidon. So these are all very clearly Mediterranean folks. And it seems reasonable to believe from the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 that Tarshish, this represents a nation like the rest of these characters do, that Tarshish is also in the Mediterranean, because that's where the sons of Japheth went. I'll read for you Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 19. It says, "And I will set a sign among them, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that have not heard my fame, or seen my glory." Okay, so it lists these people who are all associated with the sons of Japheth, with the Mediterranean folks. So these are two good reasons to think that Tarshish is, in fact, in the west, in the Mediterranean Sea. But does this conflict with the accounts of Solomon and Jehoshaphat? If we have a western Tarshish, you can see on the map here that it would probably be either in that tip of Spain or over here where Tartessus is, or perhaps in Sardinia. There are these different locations that are associated with Javan, Meshach, Tubal, these other sons of Japheth, and also Tarshish. So where is Tarshish? Is it in the east or is it in the west? Well, I think that there is actually better argumentation to go with Jonah being, or Tarshish being in the west. So I'm going to read to you from a journal article by Barry Beitzel. And he talks a lot about the nautical adventures of Solomon and Hiram. And he argues that the nautical venture listed in 1 Chronicles chapter 8, where they go to Ophir, is a separate venture from the one to Tarshish, which would be in the west. So Solomon did not have just one nautical venture going on at Ezion-Geber, but he had multiples. He had ones going east and ones going west, which would make very good sense. And perhaps the reason that the Bible is so explicit in talking about Ezion-Geber is because while Solomon has access to both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, Hiram, king of Tyre, he only has access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so this alliance with Solomon enables him to also sail to the east, where Ophir is. So there's good reason for bringing this up in the scriptures, and there's really no reason to conflate these two ventures as one and the same. Now he also says that when you read in 1 Kings where it says Jehoshaphat built ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir, he says that perhaps by the time of Jehoshaphat, the term ships of Tarshish really ended up meaning a specific type of nautical vessel, right? A specific type of ship, instead of ships that go to Tarshish. So perhaps Jehoshaphat is sending ships, this certain type of ship, a ship that originally would go to Tarshish, he's sending this type of ship to Ophir because perhaps this is a really good sea vessel. It's difficult to say, and frankly, you're going to run into problems either way you argue it. I think that there is a better argument for Tarshish being in the west, and that you can get around the difficulties that way. But in conclusion, whether Tarshish is in the east or the west, what we do know is that this is a Gentile location that symbolizes a great distance from God's presence. Okay? Tarshish is listed as being at the ends of the earth. Okay, you can read that in Psalm 72, and even Isaiah 66:19 implies it. Also, in Solomon's account, his ships took a period of 3 years to sail to Tarshish and back. So clearly, this place is representing a location that is at the ends of the earth. Okay, this is, to the ancient Israelite, in their geographical mind, this is the farthest you can get from Israel, which is, in their mind, located at the center of the earth. Okay, so here is the theological telegraphing, right? Jonah is trying to get as far away from where he knows God's will is that he possibly can. Alright? So, whether Tarshish is at the ends of the earth in the west, which would be probably Spain, or whether it is in the ends of the earth to the east, which would probably be greater Indonesia for them, the theological telegraphing is still the same. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but I bring that up to show you that, there are things in the Bible that may seem incongruent with each other, okay? And you're going to run across these. There are several that happen in the Gospels, and that's why we try to harmonize them. But it's good for us to be thinking about these things and to be ready to give an answer. We need to be studying these things in church where it's safe for us to do so before we get confronted with these things out in the world. So some takeaways from this lesson. If we look at these first couple of verses, we see that the wickedness of Nineveh came up before God's face. And we can be assured that God sees evil and he deals with it in his own time. Okay? If you look around you and look at the wickedness of even our nation and say, why doesn't God do something about this? We can take away from Jonah the fact that, God does see this evil, and he's got a plan to deal with it in his own time. And secondly, we need to remember, don't run away from God when you know his will. When God reveals his will to you to maybe witness to that unsaved neighbor, or that coworker, or maybe that family member. God wants you to do that, but it just seems too scary. Or perhaps that church ministry that you feel burdened about. That that somebody needs to step in those shoes, but you don't have time for that. No, if you know it's God's will, don't run from God. So those are a couple of takeaways from our lesson today. Next week, we will move on and talk about Jonah's interaction with the pagan sailors. I hope this lesson has been a blessing and encouragement and maybe a challenge to you. And I will see you next week. All right. God bless.